Donna Beatrix Marvera was 73 years old, the matriarch of the Marvera family these last 19 years since her husband's death, and she had never, in all her long life, asked a young woman to marry her son. On a clear morning in late February, in her private morning room with the tall east windows and the small white roses her gardener kept alive even in winter, she did exactly that. The young woman sitting opposite her was Marin Lever, 25 years old, a primary school teacher in the small district town beyond the estate's east gate, in a navy wool cardigan over a plain long gray skirt, her dark hair tied back in a low bun, her hands folded very still in her lap. Marin had brought her sister's lawyer with her, a quiet older man named Counselor Renning. She had brought, on Donna Beatrix's specific invitation, her 6-year-old niece, Liessa, who at that moment was standing in the doorway in a small red coat, looking gravely at the white roses on the windowsill. "Miss Lever," Donna Beatrix said, "I will be plain. Counselor Pellin is here on my left. He drafted what I am about to describe and he will read it aloud to you twice. My son Don Aurelio has read it. He has consented in writing. He is in the city this morning at my request so that you may say no to me in this room without him sitting in front of you. The contract you would be considering is the following." The matriarch laid her hand on the folder between them. "A consensual legal marriage between yourself and my son, for a term of 1 year from the date of signature, with separate rooms and separate lives, no expectation of romance or anything else, dissolvable by either party at any time before, on or after the year ends, with no penalty and no entanglement. The purpose, plainly stated in the contract, is to give you the immediate household standing and financial backing the courts will require of you to retain custody of your niece against the suit her father's family has filed. The family covers the fees of the best family law counsel in the city. Your niece will have her own bedroom in the east wing of this house, which I have already prepared. You continue teaching school during the year. At the day the year ends, or sooner or later, whenever you wish, you may walk. The house is yours to walk away from with no debt and no expectation." Marin Lever did not move. She did not lower her eyes. She said, "May I have the contract to read myself, ma'am?" Of course, Counselor Pellin will read it aloud first, then Counselor Renning will read it aloud, then you may read it aloud yourself, then you may take it home for the week. We will not ask for your answer today. Sebastian, the old butler, who had been standing inside the door, brought tea. Liessa was led very gently by Donna Beatrix to the side of the room, where a small embroidered footstool had been put out for her in advance, and a picture book about a fox and a hedgehog, and a cup of warm milk in a child's cup with a little blue flower painted on the side. The matriarch sat down on the footstool herself for a moment, took the child's small hand, and said, "Liessa, I have something to show you down the corridor when your aunt has finished her tea, only if you would like to come. I have made you a bedroom, in case your aunt should ever wish to bring you here. It is a room in the east wing with lavender curtains I sewed myself. The curtains are only for you. They are yours whether your aunt says yes to me today or no." The child looked very steadily up at the old woman. "Are these for me?" she said. "Only if your aunt says yes. You may have time, there is no hurry." Liessa nodded once. She turned a page of her book. Counselor Pellin read the contract aloud. Then Counselor Renning, after a pause that was longer than was necessary, read it aloud as well. Then Marin Lever read it aloud herself, line by line, in a voice so steady the butler behind her was quietly astonished. She closed the folder. "I will take the week," she said. "I will bring you my answer next Friday. Donna Beatrix, may I add a clause myself if I bring it on Friday?" "You may add 3 if you wish." "I will bring one." The matriarch walked Liessa down the long corridor to the east wing herself, holding the child's hand slowly, naming the rooms as they went. The bedroom was painted the color of fresh cream. The curtains were lavender. The bed was small and white, and the quilt at its foot was sewn in squares of cornflower and pale green. Liessa walked to the window and pressed her cheek against the curtain and stood there a long time without saying anything. Then she turned and crossed the room and put both of her small arms around Donna Beatrix's waist. "Thank you for sewing them," she said. Marin Lever returned the next Friday with a single sheet of paper, folded once in her own neat schoolteacher's hand. She read the clause aloud in the morning room, with Counselor Renning beside her, with Don Aurelio Marvera himself standing very still by the unlit fireplace, with Donna Beatrix in her chair and Counselor Pellin to the matriarch's left. "The niece, Marin read, Liessa Lever, is never, at any point in the year of this marriage or after, to be used by either party as leverage, as bargaining, or as an instrument of pressure against the other. If at any point in the year my niece does not wish to remain in this house, I take my niece and we leave without penalty and without delay. The niece is not on the rest of this paper. The niece is mine." Don Aurelio Marvera was 41 years old. He had been head of the family 7 years. He had been single since he was 32. He was tall and broad-shouldered in his charcoal three-piece suit, his short dark hair graying at the temples, his beard neatly trimmed, his dark eyes very steady. He listened to her read her clause. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he walked over to the long table, took up Councillor Pellin's pen, and signed his name to her clause before he signed his name to the rest of the contract. He laid the pen down. He looked at her once across the room briefly and inclined his head. "Miss Lever," he said, "thank you." The contract was signed at 11:30 that Friday morning. The matriarch closed the morning room door behind herself afterward, walked down the corridor to her own sitting room, and stood at the window for a quiet minute before she rang for tea. The niece moved in that same afternoon. The matriarch had asked the gardener's boy to carry up the one small trunk and the 2 picture book crates herself. She had set out on the white nightstand by the lavender curtains, a wooden bowl of pears and a small clean handkerchief embroidered with Liessa's initials. The child stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked to the window and pulled the curtains together and then apart again, very carefully, the way she had been taught to do a curtain at her own old window. Marin Lever carried up her own one suitcase. She had refused in the morning room the matriarch's offer of a maid to unpack for her. She unpacked by herself. She hung her 3 plain dresses in the wardrobe. She set her books on the desk. She closed the door of her own room, east wing, 2 doors down from the niece's, and stood with her back against it for a moment and breathed. Don Aurelio kept to the west wing of the house. Marin Lever and her niece kept to the east. They saw each other at the long dining table on the weekend evenings he was home. The matriarch sat between them and the niece often sat at Marin's elbow with her own small plate. The first month he was, the old butler observed, formal and quiet. He did not court her. He did not look at her in any way she would have had to refuse. He learned to walk past the corridor of her bedroom without knocking. He learned to leave notes for her on the household memo board in the kitchen, not at her door, a note about the boiler, a note about Otto's morning walk schedule, a note about the niece's school fete in May. She, for her part, was tired and grateful and watched her niece every minute. She did not flirt, she did not flatter, she did not pretend warmth she did not feel. In those first weeks she did sleep, in fact, more than she had slept in 2 years. The east wing room was warm and quiet. The matriarch took the niece each afternoon for an hour of needlework and small talk in the conservatory, and Marin found that she could close her own eyes for that hour without listening for the door. She had not realized how thin a year of grief and 2 part-time jobs had made her, until the thinness began slowly to leave. The thing that broke her watchfulness was the dog. Otto was the family's old golden retriever, 15 years old, gentle, a little deaf. He took to Liessa within an hour. The boss returned one Saturday in March and sat on the long stone porch above the back garden for an hour with the child while Otto lapped water from a small ceramic bowl. From the doorway of the library, where she had been shelving picture books, Marin heard the man's quiet voice telling a small true story about himself at 6 years old, about a kite his late father had made him fly from this very porch, the kite that had gone on its first flight straight into the chestnut tree by the wall and had hung there for 3 days before the gardener's son climbed up to fetch it. The niece laughed at the chestnut tree. The boss laughed too, briefly, a sound the butler had not heard in the house in a long time. Marin stood very still in the doorway. Something turned very small inside her chest, and she did not yet name it. The custody hearing came at month 3. He sat beside her in the courtroom that morning, composed in his charcoal suit, his hand near hers on the bench but not touching. The husband's family's lawyer, a polished man from a polished city firm, suggested in his opening that the marriage was a sham, that no court should regard it as a stable home. The family law counsel they had retained, a small gray-haired woman named Councillor Estrade who had won this kind of case for 30 years, did not argue with him. She called 4 witnesses. She called Donna Beatrix Marvera, who read aloud, slowly and with her old-fashioned diction, the consent clauses of the contract, that the marriage was for 1 year, terminable by either party at any time, with no penalty, with separate rooms, with the niece's clause attached. She called Liessa's primary school principal, who read aloud the niece's school attendance and academic records for the year, both before and after the move to the estate. They had improved. She called the niece's pediatrician, a woman of 50 in plain navy, who had examined the child that week and said simply that she was healthy, cherished, and at her age-appropriate weight for the first time in 2 years. She called Don Aurelio Marvera. He stood at the witness rail in his charcoal suit, raised his right hand, and read aloud in his quiet voice the clause Marin had added to the contract in her own hand, that the niece is never to be used as leverage, that if the niece did not wish to remain, the aunt was to leave with her without penalty and without delay, that the niece is not on the rest of the paper. The judge ruled in the aunt's favor before the lunch break. The niece remained with her aunt. In the corridor outside the courtroom afterward, the husband's family's lawyer offered Don Aurelio a stiff handshake which the boss accepted, briefly and without comment, and the husband's family themselves, three of them very richly dressed, walked past Marin without a word. Marin did not look at them. She looked at Counselor Estrade and she said, "Thank you." The gray-haired woman took her hand in both of hers for a moment and said, "Miss Lever, every word in your clause held in there. The judge said as much from the bench. That was all that was ever said about it." The 6 months that followed were the months in which, the butler later said, the slow thing happened. Marin continued teaching school. The niece bloomed. The matriarch and the niece became inseparable in the afternoons, sewing, picture books on the porch with Otto at their feet, small lessons in the kitchen about whether bread had risen enough, walks down to the little wooden gate at the end of the back garden to look at the geese on the pond. The boss was home, the butler noticed, more often than the contract required him to be. He was becoming a quiet third corner of the household. He learned to make Marin's coffee the way she liked it, black, no sugar, very hot. He learned the niece's bedtime book by the third reading and could prompt her gently when she forgot her line. He learned, with great care, when to leave Marin alone in the library, and when to walk past the open library door and say only good evening on his way to his study. He never knocked on her bedroom door. He never crossed into the east wing. He took, instead, a small habit no one in the house remarked on at first. On Saturday mornings, he sat with the niece on the porch and read to her for half an hour from whichever picture book she chose, while Otto lay across his shoes. By the second month of this habit, Marin would come to the library window above the porch and stand listening, her own work paused in her hand. By the third month she had begun, very quietly, to bring her marking down to the porch and sit on the bench at the far end with her papers in her lap. They did not speak much during those Saturday hours. They did not have to. In month 11, on a quiet Sunday evening in early November, he sat down beside her on the wooden bench at the foot of the back garden while the niece played with Otto on the porch above them. The light was going gray over the chestnut tree. He said plainly, "The year ends in 3 weeks. You may dissolve this whenever you wish. I will sign whatever paper you bring me. I will not stand in your way." She said plainly, "I know." He waited, she waited. He said plainly, "If you wished, only if you wished, would you consider keeping me? Not the contract, me, on your own terms, with as much time as you need." She did not answer at once. She watched the niece scratch behind Otto's deaf old ear. "Give me a week," she said. He nodded, he stood. He walked back up to the porch the long way around the rose bed so that he did not have to pass her on the path. A week later, on a Sunday morning in mid-November, 3 weeks before the year contract was set to lapse, Marin Lever came to the morning room of her own accord. The matriarch was there, Counselor Pellin was there, Don Aurelio Marvera was there, standing very still by the unlit fireplace exactly as he had stood 10 months before. Marin had a single sheet of paper, folded once in her own neat hand. She read it aloud. "This paper voids the contract dated last February in its entirety. In place of that contract we will continue as we are now without an end date until either of us wishes otherwise. Either of us may walk at any time without penalty, with no entanglement, with no expectation. The niece, Liesa Lever, is not on this paper. The niece is mine. This is not a marriage contract. It is a household one. The marriage stays." She laid the paper on the table. Don Aurelio Marvera came across the room and took up Counselor Pellin's pen and signed his name to her paper. He did not speak. He laid the pen down and stepped back. Marin signed beneath him. The matriarch closed the morning room door behind herself afterward. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall by the window of the small painting of her late husband, and she wept very quietly for a full minute, and then composed herself and went to find Counselor Pellin to ask him for a fresh draft of an addendum to her own late husband's will. The next morning at breakfast, Liesa, now 7, in her small gray school cardigan, looked across the table at the boss over her toast. "What should I call you?" she said, "now that you are staying?" He looked at Marin. Marin nodded. He said, "Whatever you like, child, my given name is fine, or you may call me anything else you choose." The child tried his given name. She tried Uncle Aurelio. She tried Mr. Marvera, very formal, and laughed at her own formality. She settled after a few moments on his given name. He inclined his head to her as he had to her aunt the day the first contract was signed. The matriarch passed the bread. The old butler, who had been standing inside the door these 43 years of his service, would say much later when he was asked that there had been nothing romantic about that breakfast in the easy sense, no embrace, no declaration, no scene. There had been a child trying out a name. There had been an aunt nodding once. There had been a feared man, plain in his charcoal suit, accepting whatever name he was given by a child who had chosen him. There had been an old woman passing the bread. The butler had watched the dignity of every party in that room for a long, quiet minute, and he had understood with the slow certainty of a man who had served one family for half a century that the household had become, in the most ordinary and the most uncoerced way, whole. Outside on the porch, Otto thumped his old tail once against the warm stone, and the lavender curtains in the east wing window above the chestnut tree moved a little in the morning breeze.